A young woman goes missing on a night out.
Please come forward with any information you may have, no matter how small or irrelevant it may be. We just want Libby home.
Prime suspect is a mystery man who for months has terrorised the student population.
I think each time he was never caught. So he was emboldened. He became more and more dangerous.
Libby Squire was missing, presumed dead. How could detectives piece together the evidence to uncover a killer? At 2:21 a.m. on Friday the 1st of February 2019, a student named Libby Squire was reported missing by friends. Just a few hours earlier, she and they had set off for a night out in Hull.
Libby's friends wanted to go out to the student nightclub, the Welly, and Libby wasn't very keen, but her friends persuaded her that she should come along.
She'd gone to, I think, at least 2 other flats, and they'd had a drink there.
It was a bitterly cold evening with below freezing temperatures and fog expected overnight. There was already a blanket of snow on the ground. Security cameras along Hull's bustling Beverley Road would later reveal to detectives snapshots of how the night developed.
Those who were with Libby Squire on the night became aware quite quickly after they left the house. The cold seemed to have hit her hard, and she was noticeably intoxicated.
And that was quite obvious from the way she was pictured walking on CCTV.
It was not a great surprise to them when they arrived at the nightclub and the doorman said, "She's too drunk, she's not going to come in." It was at this stage that Libby said, "I'm going to walk home." But they said, no, look, they're very sensible. They said, "We're going to put you in the back of a taxi to make sure that you get home all right."
They paid the driver and they gave the driver her home address.
It was 11:30 p.m. on Thursday 31st of January when Libby's friends saw her into the cab. Less than 2 hours later, her housemates returned home and discovered that she wasn't in her bed.
When they got in, they found her room was empty, like it hadn't been disturbed since she left, and her phone was on the side, so she didn't have her phone with her.
Her housemates, when they discovered that she hadn't returned home, they obviously were immediately very concerned because it was out of character for Libby.
They set out and visited some of the takeaways that they knew she liked and hoping she might be there, and eventually even decided to get into a car and just drive around a bit looking for her.
They drove around the areas that they would go out, the bars, other houses that they would go to, just to see if they could see her anywhere, if they could find her anywhere.
It got to a point where they used Libby's phone to contact Libby's mother and just to say, she's disappeared and what should we do?
And eventually they did decide to ring the police in the early hours of that morning.
Humberside police launched a search. Meanwhile, they worked to build a picture of the missing student's life and background. A second-year philosophy undergraduate, Liberty Anna Squire, was known to everyone as Libby.
Libby Squire was from High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. She was the eldest of 4 children to her father Russell and her mother Lisa. She was incredibly close to her mother in particular.
She'd had a difficult time as a teenager. She'd struggled with her mental health.
Investigators hear that after her A-levels, Libby had taken a gap year and travelled abroad. She had worked hard to overcome her difficulties.
It had taken her a lot of courage to go to university, to leave home and start that new life for herself. But she'd done that.
She was settled and she was exhilarated not only by being social, as many students are, but her family said she loved her studies as well, and so she was throwing herself into it in a very big way. She was clearly bright, she was popular.
Libby lived in a student house with a group of girls on Wellesley Avenue. They were very close friends. The house got on very well together. There
are over 14,000 students living in Hull, and the majority of those do live off campus, and they live in the areas immediately surrounding the university in Newland Avenue, Beverley Road, Cottingham Road, those areas. And they do live side by side with the local residents. And I think the relationship between the local residents and the students is a really good one.
Detectives quickly tracked down the taxi driver who had taken Libby home the night she went missing. He told police that after he dropped her off, He drove away along Wellesley Avenue in the city. When he glanced back, Libby appeared to be walking towards her front door. But after viewing security footage from the street, police realised that something had made Libby turn around and walk away from home.
Sadly, she made the tragic decision not to go into the house. She fell over in the road. She was seen to do that by a group of young men.
It was very cold in Hull that night. I mean, there was some suggestion she may have been suffering the early effects of hypothermia because she wasn't particularly dressed for the warmth. So she fell over several times. She was seen staggering along Wellesley Avenue where she lived, to the point that some students that lived nearby sort of brought her into their house and said, "Oh, are you okay?"
She was very distressed. She wasn't making much sense.
Unfortunately, when she left, she'd actually dropped her house keys. And so she was then wandering, clearly disorientated, clearly quite drunk, around the Wellesley Avenue, Beverley Road area without any way of getting back home.
Libby's keys on a pink keyring were found the next morning in the garden of her house. In those crucial hours and days after Libby's disappearance, both the student population and the wider community rallied around.
There were leaflets being handed out to people in the city centre, and there were billboards in the city centre just to make people aware of her disappearance.
Local reporter Amy Murphy and her colleagues were soon joined in Hull by journalists from across the UK as Libby's disappearance became a national story. Jack Hardy was one of them.
From the geography of the area, it was obvious that there were only so many places that Libby Squire could have disappeared. You know, there was a small river nearby which was being searched very thoroughly by the police. But beyond that, around there's not many places that a 21-year-old can suddenly vanish.
One of her friends at the university organised a search at the university, which 200 students turned up to take part in. The search went on over that first weekend that she was missing, and I think mainly took place in the university grounds and in university premises, just in case she might have been there somewhere.
Libby is our kind, thoughtful, beautiful girl who is loved by so many people.
4 days after Libby had gone missing, her parents, Lisa and Russell Squire, recorded an appeal that was issued through Humberside Police, where they really appealed for Libby to return home safely.
I miss you so much. It's breaking my heart not knowing where you are. I love you more.
It was around this time that detectives heard reports of a possible sighting.
Members of the media did track down some CCTV footage that appeared to show two people getting into a car and driving away.
Was this a breakthrough in the hunt for Libby? Who was the man she had been seen with, captured on CCTV? In the week after Libby Squire went missing, 3 women came forward to police with worrying allegations. They told officers that they had very recently been the victims of a man in the area. The offences fell into the category of offending public decency. He was a sexual predator. Was there a connection between these crimes and Libby's disappearance?
By early 2019, there had been a serial sex attacker on the loose in Hull student area for about 18 months. The first offence in time was in July 2017, when a woman was having sex with her partner late at night when she saw a man looking through her window. She looked around and she confronted him and he ran away.
One of the offences was on the road where Libby Squire lived. Sexual harassment of young women was not a new occurrence in the neighbourhood.
He was committing offences of voyeurism, that is, creeping up to the windows or doors of women and peering into their bedrooms or houses as they were coming out of the shower, targeting houses generally of the student population. He had been committing burglaries, so breaking into their houses, stealing computers, cameras, electrical goods. But these weren't just acquisitive crimes, they were sexually motivated. He was also stealing sex toys, underwear.
The man had not been caught, and over time, his actions had become increasingly audacious.
By the time we get to January 2019, this type of offending had escalated.
And I think each time, you know, he was never caught. So he was emboldened. He became more and more dangerous.
He targeted students. All of the offences that he committed, we put on a map, and they were all within a couple of square miles. And there's a lot of student accommodation in that area. I would say 80%, maybe more. And I suspect he knew when he broke into the premises, especially at the end, that he knew that it was occupied by students, and he knew that it was occupied by female students, because he would have seen them coming and going.
Word of the attacks spread to both students and the local population.
There was a sense in the community that there was somebody at large who was committing these sorts of offences.
They were aware that there was a predator who was stalking women, who were taking advantage of students out with their friends, socialising, just having a few drinks, you know, and taking advantage of their vulnerability of heading home.
Part of his modus operandi was not just to commit these sexual offences, but was to make sure that the women knew that he had been observing them, leaving behind these calling cards or making sure that they saw him as he was masturbating at them in the street. And so there was a sense in which he was excited by their fear and excited by them seeing him.
If he was seen by a member of the public, normally 2 or 3 females, he kept doing what he was doing. He wasn't intimidated by them, he didn't run off. He made it quite clear that he had seen them and they had seen him, and he kept doing what he was doing.
Had Libby Squire come into contact with a sexual predator? Was he the man captured on CCTV with Libby? As the search for Libby continued, the sex offender at large in the area was a major line of inquiry. Had Libby crossed paths with him? The biggest question of all, was she still alive?
There were actually 2 very parallel investigations going on here. They were publicly saying it was a missing person investigation, but they were treating this as an abduction.
Identifying this car and its driver became a top priority in the search for Libby Squire. 5 days after she was last seen, a breakthrough. Specialist officers scouring CCTV noticed something curious. They picked up one car in particular over and over again from the night that she went missing, and in the same area.
Police trawled through hundreds of hours of CCTV once they realised that there was this vehicle apparently right next to where Libby was last seen.
It was a silver Vauxhall Astra. Since 8 o'clock on the evening of Thursday, 31st of January, it had been seen driving slowly around the Newlands Avenue area, stopping only to refuel. Could it have been the same car seen parked on Hayworth Street later that night? A car that drove away shortly afterwards, with 2 people inside. Another piece of surveillance video was brought to officers' attention.
Slowly trawling through all of this CCTV, they were able to find a car, they were able to find a licence plate.
The vehicle's registration was run through the national database. The silver hatchback belonged to this man, 24-year-old Pawel Relowicz. Who was he? What could he tell them about the missing student? Officers began trawling through public records.
Pawel Relowicz was a Polish citizen, born and brought up in Poland.
From a village in northern Poland called Borsowice. He was one of 8 children, so he was from a big working class family. And it was from a very strictly religious community. It was a very small place where he was from. It was the type of place where everybody knew each other's business.
He met a Polish woman after he'd moved to the United Kingdom, married her here, had 2 young children. He was an utterly ordinary man by appearance and by achievement. Nothing special about him at all.
He worked in a meat processing factory in a town called Malton, which is about 20 miles from Hull.
Detectives building a picture of this person of interest discovered that Pawel Relowicz had come to the UK in 2012. The family had settled in the Newlands area of Hull, not far from where Libby lived. He was not a man who had ever come to the attention of police.
Pawel Relowicz had never been arrested in the United Kingdom, and that meant that the police didn't have his DNA or his fingerprints on file.
Never arrested, so his DNA not on the national database. Officers were suspicious enough to pay him a visit. They descended upon his home on Raglan Street after dark on Wednesday, 6th of February.
Very early on the morning of Thursday, the 7th of February, the Humberside Police issued a release saying that they had arrested a suspect in the investigation. A 24-year-old man had been arrested on suspicion of the abduction of Libby. It turned out that he had been arrested the previous evening and was being questioned.
Detectives were keen to find out what, if anything, Pawel Relowicz knew about Libby Squire. By this time, she had been missing for a week. Her bank cards had not been used. She did not have her phone. Was she alive, or more likely dead? Even as some detectives asked Relowicz questions, their colleagues were making a disturbing discovery.
All of a sudden, it lifted the lid on this secret life that Pawel Relowicz had had.
Crime officers at the home of Pawel Relowicz on Hull's Raglan Street didn't have to look far to find something that raised a red flag.
In the boot of his car, they found a pink holdall, which was described as being full of trophies from his sexually motivated burglaries.
Women's underwear, pictures of women that he had taken as he'd been raiding these houses over the course of the last 18 months.
At that point, they're then thinking, well, what's going on here?
When Pawel Relowicz was arrested, police were able to take his DNA, and that linked him to this pattern of offending that had been going on in the community.
For Mike Wardby, it was an unexpected twist in the search for Libby Squire.
When they arrested him, they didn't suspect him of those crimes. It was just a natural process. You're in custody. Let's have your fingerprints. Let's have your DNA. They put that into the system as a part of the routine investigation, and they materialised. So it wasn't only at that point the missing person in relation to Libby being missing, but they then thought there is another side to this.
All of a sudden, it lifted the lid on this secret life that Pawel Relowicz had had.
His was the DNA that had been extracted from discarded condoms left around the neighbourhood in the months before Libby disappeared.
He came back as being the person involved because of the DNA hit that they'd got. So they developed that, and as a result of that, they built evidence. They came to us. Decisions were made to charge him with, in the end, a total of 13 offences for incidents in that area, and in particular 3 incidents in January of 2019 where he had burgled a house and stolen some sex toys, and on 2 occasions he'd been masturbating in the street.
Pawel deliberately targeted the student community of Hull, and he deliberately set out to stalk, harass and abuse.
Relowicz's loved ones expressed shock at the double life that he'd been living.
To everyone who knew him, he was a quiet and polite boy. He was the type of man who would just avoid trouble at all costs, and his mother said he was sensitive. She said he was so reluctant to get involved in fights, he'd feel faint at the sight of blood. His sister, meanwhile, told us that he was the type of man who didn't really hang around with any other male friends. He would always have a woman in his life, but it'd be one woman to whom he was entirely devoted, and he would care for her, and she didn't think he would ever do anything to betray her.
Relowicz's family were to find out that the sexual offending was merely the start.
The police were questioning Relowicz for quite a number of days. They got extensions so that they could continue questioning him. And it wasn't until the Sunday evening that a charge was made. And when the charge came through, it wasn't what people were expecting.
We said, well, looking at those offences on their own, they are serious and they need to be investigated whilst you continue to look for Libby.
People were expecting that he might be charged with the murder of Libby or with the abduction of Libby at that point. But in actual fact, he was then charged with a series of sexual offences, including voyeurism and outraging public decency.
And I think the last one of those was a matter of about 10 days before the incident on the 31st of January into the 1st of February.
Relowicz was charged on Sunday 10th of February, but the accusations did not relate to Libby's disappearance. He denied knowing anything about the missing young woman, her whereabouts still unknown 10 days on.
He tried to claim that he knew nothing about it. He didn't. How was he supposed to know where this girl was?
Relowicz was still the best lead that detectives had, but even after his arrest, they were no closer to finding Libby. They had nothing to directly link the suspect and the missing student. Frame by frame, they continued to scour hours and hours of grainy CCTV footage. Could they find a shot of Relowicz and Libby together? They track Libby's movements, coming across sightings of her speaking with numerous strangers.
And it was clear that, you know, people were concerned, but she didn't take up the invitations to assist her. She had mood changes and swings. She was, I'm crying, I'm upset, will you help me? And then when people offered help, she just didn't want to know them. Maybe she was then thinking, you're a complete stranger, I don't, you know. So it was difficult for these people to provide any form of assistance, so they went on their way.
Cold and confused, Libby sat for 10 minutes on a bench at the junction of Beverley Road and Hayworth Street. Another Good Samaritan approached her.
The police had said that a motorist had been passing on Beverley Road that night and had seen Libby in the snow next to the road. I think the motorist had tried to help her and then had got back in the car and driven away.
At 11:57 p.m, CCTV showed Libby on the move once again, heading southwards along Beverley Road.
Now, at this point, Libby is actually, sadly, walking up the road in the direction of safety. She's walking back towards Wellesley Avenue. You can see she's uneven on her feet because she's staggering from one side of the road to the other.
Libby could not have known that someone was tracking her along Beverley Road at that very moment. In parallel with reconstructing Libby's movements on security footage, police were also retracing the footsteps of Pawel Relowicz that cold Thursday evening, beginning at 8 p.m, when he told his wife he was going out.
He was out and about on Beverley Road, told his wife he'd gone out running, exercising.
He was not dressed for exercise. Wearing black and white trainers and distinctive jeans, he was seen at 8:35 p.m. at a petrol station. He was fueling up for what police would learn was an evening cruising the streets of Hull. At 9:11 p.m, Relowicz's car was picked up turning down Beresford Avenue towards Oak Road playing fields, somewhere that would become a key location in the investigation.
They built up an incredible picture of him cruising around the streets of Hull, stopping in certain locations, getting out of his car, and these are all locations in which he had in the past committed sexual offences. And so we were able to build up this pattern of him cruising about looking for people to offend against.
On the night of the 31st, he was looking for what he described as easy sex.
Police found no evidence from the footage to suggest he was successful in that particular mission. But pictures from 11:57 p.m, the night Libby went missing, became crucial. The breakthrough in the case came from the discovery of this grainy footage.
So the clip starts with a camera that's overlooking a corner near Hayworth Street, and it shows a man climbing out the car, which is Pawel Relowicz's car. It's 23:55, according to the clock, so just before midnight.
By pure chance, he parked his car in the dead end of Hayworth Street, which is a road that joins Beverley Road, almost exactly at that bus stop where Libby had stopped. He couldn't have seen her when he parked, but he got out of the car to go off and try and find a woman to offend against.
And then on the corner, you see a man who's highlighted by one arrow, a red arrow. He is walking past where a green arrow is pointing to where Libby Squire is sitting. So he's actually walked past her and he's walked off across the road,
pretending that he hadn't noticed her, and disappeared just into the shadows of Beresford Avenue. And we know that he then waited on Beresford Avenue and watched. And what he was watching was for whether she was on her own or with somebody else. In other words, he was watching to see whether this could be his opportunity.
This footage shows the very moment that Pawel Relowicz chose to enter the world of Libby Squire.
She set off walking up the road, and we then saw him on CCTV emerging from Beresford, not crossing the road to the side that Libby was on, but hugging the tree line in the shadows on the opposite side of the road, just stalking her as she walked up the road.
It was only when she dips off into the entrance to this very quiet and dark, secluded area on Beverley Road that suddenly Pawel Relowicz shoots across and intercepts her. They're now walking alongside each other back down the road. He's right next to her, presumably claiming to be offering some kind of help, and she's in a distressed and a confused state, and he's preying on that, basically. They really come quite into sharp focus at around 12:02 and 24 seconds, because they're lit up by the light of a bus stop, and so it's that first time you can see his quite bulky silhouette next to her slender frame as she staggers from side to side back, inexorably, sadly, in the direction of his car, which is parked on nearby Hayworth Street.
He's communicating with her, as anybody would be if they had good intentions.
We don't know exactly what passed between them.
There's no sound, so we can't say what was said, but he's then persuading her to go back to his car, which is across the road and just parked down a side street.
Police officers studying the security tapes could not tell what Pawel Relowicz was saying to Libby Squire during their brief journey on foot towards his vehicle on Hayworth Street.
And it's at this point the CCTV cuts back to his car on Hayworth Street. You see the lights flash. He's on.
Caused it to come off her wrist, and we suggested to the jury that was him forcing her into the car.
She gets in the car and he then gets in the driver's seat and they drive off together, and he comes back onto Beverley Road.
It was a troubling sign for the fate of the missing Libby. Now in custody, Relowicz still denied wrongdoing. Where was Libby Squire, and what did Pawel Relowicz really know?
This witness heard desperate screams from a woman coming from the playing fields.
CCTV footage had exposed Pawel Relowicz as a liar. In his first police interviews, he had insisted that he had not come into contact with Libby Squire on the night that she vanished. Now, he finally admitted that he had met the missing woman.
He was saying that he had picked up this girl who was looking distressed on the side of the street, wanting to drive her home, and then she'd thrown herself at him, and he'd said, no, I'm a married man, and get out of my car.
He was consistent at that point in the sense that he said, yes, she'd been in my car. Yes, I was trying to help her. She made advances to me. She got out the car. I didn't see her again.
Was there any truth in this version of events? It brought police no closer to finding Libby, and they still didn't have the evidence to definitively link Pawel Relowicz with her disappearance. Detectives needed more. Painstaking examination of yet more CCTV footage revealed a car pulling up by the Oak Road playing fields at 11 minutes past 12 on February the 1st, around the time that Relowicz claimed he had dropped Libby off.
So there are a few very, very indistinct bits of CCTV which show Pawel Relowicz's car arriving at the Oak Road playing fields. It's marked by a red arrow in the first clip where you can just see the corner of a headlight, and then the second clip also marked by an arrow, just the flash of a headlight as it goes past. It's just after midnight at this point, and these are houses that are right on the edge of the Oak Road playing field, so you could see him turning off Beverley Road in the direction of the Oak Road playing field, and then arriving there within a minute or two later, and you can see that's how they placed him at the scene where Libby had been seen for the final time.
8 or 9 minutes later, the silver hatchback left the playing field and was seen driving back along Beverley Road. The footage gave officers searching for Libby a new search area and a new line of inquiry, but not one that offered much hope of a positive outcome.
Once they'd basically searched every area around the general area several times, the river was within about 400 yards of where Mr. Relowicz had parked his car and said that he'd been with her. And their investigations led them to believe that they'd been out of the car and there'd been some sort of altercation or incident in the park, because they had evidence from witnesses that they'd heard screaming.
We had evidence from a young man who lived in a house, the only house, that stood alone on Oak Road playing fields. And his was crucial evidence, because we knew exactly when Relowicz had taken Libby to the playing fields. And this witness was woken from his sleep, and at 14 minutes past midnight, at exactly the time that Libby was there with Relowicz, heard desperate screams from a woman coming from the playing fields.
There was more.
After a few minutes, he saw a man who he would describe as not looking like he was dressed for a night out, walking quickly, not running, but walking with a determination to get away from the playing fields. As he interpreted it, he didn't look back, and he could see him, and there was enough ambient light to him to make out the details of this man, and he thought that it was very suspicious. And ultimately, when he did see a picture of Relowicz a few weeks later, he was pretty confident that that was the man he had seen.
This was crucial evidence, because this was plainly Relowicz attacking and killing Libby and then leaving the scene as quickly as he could.
They'd only seen one person go back to the car, so if they couldn't find her on the ground, the suspicion was that she'd either fallen in or been put in the river by him.
Detectives felt they had a strong case, but without finding Libby's body, they had no proof that this is what had happened to her or that Relowicz had been involved. It would be 7 weeks before they and Libby's loved ones had an answer.
Unfortunately, after he had killed Libby on the playing fields, in a particularly cruel act, he put her body into the River Hull. And from there it passed out into the River Humber and out into the North Sea off Spurn Point. And it was many weeks before her body was spotted floating in the water off Spurn Point and was recovered by the lifeboat, the Pride of the Humber, and recovered by the police.
And there were some telling details even at that point that it was Libby Squire. She still had a slender gold necklace around her neck which had the letter L on it. And it was only after subsequent tests they were able to fully confirm it was, in fact, the 21-year-old who'd gone missing all these weeks earlier.
Now that Libby's body had been found, could police and prosecutors secure a conviction?
It was crucial to find the body, because that was finally the point at which they could start to put together a proper murder investigation, a proper murder charge that they could bring against Relowicz.
After so long in the water, it was not certain that a pathologist would be able to uncover exactly what had happened to Libby.
We didn't know whether that would take the inquiry any further at that point, because obviously we knew that if she was found in water, she'd probably been in water for 6 to 7 weeks.
Police and prosecutors faced a long, tense wait to find out what evidence Libby's body might reveal. Until then, they could not charge Relowicz with murder. In the meantime, he stood trial for the 2-year reign of terror that he'd carried out against Hull's student community.
Relowicz appeared at Hull Magistrates' Courts in the first instance, facing these sexual offences. and then he was sent to Hull Crown Court. He always denied the offences at first, and he was set to go on trial at Sheffield Crown Court in August 2019.
It was actually deemed that it would be appropriate that it was held further away from the city because it had been something that had really inflamed local opinion, I think, and that there was a concern that he might not be able to get a fair trial in Hull.
In August 2019, Relowicz stood accused of voyeurism, outraging public decency and burglary.
On the day that his trial was due to start, he changed his plea to guilty on 9 of the 13 offences that he was charged with.
He went on to be sentenced for a string of sexual offences for 8.5 years by the judge in Sheffield, but this was actually reduced to 5.5 years on appeal.
Relowicz was 3 months into his sentence by the time the results of Libby's post-mortem came back. It had failed to establish how Libby died, but it did uncover revealing evidence of the crime.
His semen was found on a high vaginal swab taken from the body. That was crucial evidence because he had told the police, when asked about it, that he'd left her alive and well and there'd been no sexual contact between them at all. And yet here was this finding of his semen on the high vaginal swab that proved he was lying and proved that he had raped her.
For detectives at Humberside Police, it was a crucial piece of evidence. They charged Relowicz with murder. By throwing Libby's body into the river, he had hoped the authorities would never get hold of the evidence to see him convicted.
It was at the Oak Road playing fields that it was said at court that he carried out the sex attack on Libby and then dumped her body into the river, either dead or dying, and it was swept out. And he was hoping that that would be the end of his problems. He knew the area, he knew the river, and he knew that it would take her out to the Humber estuary, and then hopefully this would never be something he would have to answer for.
Relowicz was wrong. 9 months after Libby's disappearance, he was charged with rape and murder of Libby Squire.
Relowicz always denied raping and murdering Libby, and he eventually went on trial at Sheffield Crown Court in January 2021.
The trial lasted 2 weeks. The eyes of the world were on the court as the Crown presented its evidence.
It was fair to say that there was a lot riding on this. I mean, that there had been this long build-up during which Libby's family felt that they hadn't got answers and they were looking for justice.
The media attention was more than I've ever experienced.
And it was tense because, this was a crime that really struck at the heart of the community in Hull, and I think that the whole city really wanted to see justice for Libby.
All you can do as a prosecutor is build the very strongest case that you can. I was confident that the police had investigated this case to the highest standards and that there was a compelling body of evidence to put before the jury. But ultimately, it's always a matter for the jury to decide these cases.
Wright laid out for jurors the evidence against Pawel Relowicz.
The CCTV material was absolutely crucial.
Relowicz denied it all, changing his story for a third time.
Pawel Relowicz lied consistently from the very first moment that he was arrested until the very end. His lies changed over time. He gave different accounts.
He wasn't willing to concede anything or give away anything unless he was very much held to account over it.
At the heart of it, he denied doing anything to Libby. He denied that he'd raped her. He denied that he'd hurt her. He denied that he'd put her body in the river. And he lied, and he lied, and he lied, and he maintained those lies to the bitter end.
What was Relowicz's claim about his encounter with Libby Squire?
He had met Libby on the evening of her disappearance. He had taken her to Oak Road playing fields where they had had consensual sex, and he had left her safe and well.
Which must be an unbelievably difficult thing for her family and those who loved her to hear, because he was trying to claim that Libby Squire had initiated sex with him, and he was a good Samaritan. He was trying to drive her home and make sure she was safe, and then she had thrown herself at him, and he had had a moment of moral weakness in that he'd betrayed his wife.
Would a jury believe him? In court, prosecutors confronted Relowicz with a final piece of CCTV evidence.
There was also extensive CCTV footage of Pawel Relowicz driving around Hull and walking around the student area, Newland Avenue, near where he lives, for hours after he raped and killed Libby Squire, including at 3 a.m. He was just walking around Newland Avenue by himself. It's thought he even masturbated in the street, which was confirmed by a used condom which was found nearby, found to contain his DNA by someone in the following days.
Taking the stand to give evidence in his own defence, Relowicz told the court that, after having what he claimed was consensual sex with Libby Squire, he was still unsatisfied. He had stalked the streets looking for another woman. The jury didn't buy it.
He was unanimously convicted of rape and convicted of murder by an 11-to-1 majority decision. The judge, Mrs. Justice Lambert, sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years.
The verdict was of little comfort to Libby's parents, Lisa and Russ.
I remember her mother speaking after the verdict. And for them, the verdict changes nothing. It will never bring Libby back.
The trial for them, they knew, was not going to bring their daughter back. It wasn't about some sort of vengeance. It was more about their need to hear about what had happened to their daughter and to hear the truth about what had happened to her. Unfortunately, they didn't get that from Relowicz because he didn't tell the truth about what had happened.
A review of how Humberside's police had dealt with Relowicz's offences prior to Libby's murder concluded that detectives had investigated the incidents proportionately. The area of Hull from where Libby disappeared remains popular with locals and students alike. Police will continue their regular patrols, something which locals have welcomed, as the memory of the terror wrought by Pawel Relowicz lingers.
There was a real sense of there but for the grace of God go I, in that any woman, alone at night, could have fallen into Relowicz's path and have been subjected to that sort of sexual violence and murder.
When Pawel Relowicz picked up a vulnerable young woman with the intention of doing her harm, he believed he could cover his tracks and escape apprehension for his crime. His calculations were undone by the painstaking work of police officers who reconstructed the events of that freezing winter night, frame by frame, from the city's plentiful CCTV footage. And when Libby Squire's body surfaced in the Humber estuary, it provided the crucial evidence needed to prove Relowicz's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Relowicz had made the simplest mistake of all. He had forgotten that cities like Hull are full of security cameras.